I'm David Neer, publisher of The Down Ballot. My co-host Aaron Rupar of Public Notice is finally back. Aaron, I'm really glad you're back. I'm sorry though that the circumstances of this week couldn't possibly suck worse. And what we are seeing there's so many things we could say about what happened this week. There's so many things we don't want to say and shouldn't say. But a point that I feel like you have been emphasizing in a lot of your coverage of the clips are all the ways in which Trump and the GOP writ large are taking the murder of Charlie Kirk and completely abusing it for their own ends with absolutely no regard for the grief that his family is feeling right now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this kind of falls under the heading of shocking, but not necessarily surprising. The fact that you had Trump today on Fox and Friends actually, asked a decent question by um, Ainsley Earhardt, who's not known for asking decent questions, but she, basically pointed out to him that right-wing radicalism is also a problem, as well as radicals on all sides of the spectrum. And what does he plan to do about that? And, he basically, matter of factly said, he said something to the effect of, I don't have it in front of me, but he said, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but with the right-wing radicals, they are against crime. And so the real problem are the left-wing radicals. And so, just putting it in explicitly partisan context like that, trying to find a scapegoat, which is very par for the course for MAGA. So it's been kind of disillusioning in that sense. I mean, again, not really surprising, but, you can kind of see where they would like to take this narrative of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And, as you and I are talking here on Friday afternoon, details are kind of trickling out about the person who was arrested, whose name is Tyler Anderson, a 22-year-old from Utah. But from what seems to be kind of out there in terms of his social media and whatnot, he comes from a family in Utah that is very into guns, which is not actually that exceptional for that part of the country. It was actually coincidentally in Utah for a wedding just last weekend, and we stayed 2 nights in Provo, which is basically right next door to Orem, where the shooting occurred. So it was right in that part of the world. And on the bride's side of the family, which is not my relative side of the family, but his spouse's, her family lives in Utah, and they're very much, part of that kind of like right-wing gun culture there. Seem like good people, but the point simply being that there doesn't seem to be anything, kind of radical left about this guy, so to speak. I'm seeing some speculation that he's a groyper or, kind of has political views that are really influenced by like online message boards and kind of like incel meme culture, that sort of thing. We don't really know all of that yet. I mean, this is kind of people just re-upping social media posts and sort of drawing inferences. But and so I guess, we'll have to see if the fact that this assassination doesn't really conform to the narrative that I think MAGAs would want it to, if that kind of tamps down their effort to politicize it. But my hunch is that it really won't, because, we can think back on the attempted assassination of Trump last summer in Butler. And it's always, it's kind of one of those things that's like, when you reflect on this, it's become such an article of faith on the right that was like a political hit. And that, it was part of like the incendiary rhetoric on the left that led to that, when in fact the shooter there was a registered Republican and didn't really seem to have coherent political views kind of beyond that. So it's one of those situations where I think Trump and, the people who enable him like to kind of stuff these things into preconceived narratives. We're already seeing some of that. And like I said, we'll have to see as the days unfold here, whether the fact that the shooter doesn't really seem to have coherent politics, at least based on what we know now, if that changes things or if they just continue to run with it.
By the way, if you are a paid subscriber either of the Down Ballot or Public Notice, you can chime in with questions. We will take all your questions in the chat box below. Aaron, I think you really just hit the nail on the head, though, which is you were giving a very thorough, cautious summation of what we do and don't know, which is exactly what you should expect from political leaders. And that's exactly the opposite, 100% the opposite of what Trump and the entire GOP have been doing. From the moment of the shooting, they instantly concluded that this was some sort of left-wing plot fomented by Democratic rhetoric. They don't care about the facts. They don't care about, as you were pointing out earlier, they don't care about right wing violence fomented by right wing rhetoric, which is unquestionably far worse in this country. They are simply going to use this however they can and however it suits them. In a way, it reminds me a lot of 9/11, which was perpetrated by a terrorist group that had absolutely no connection to Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq. And yet, Bush and the neocons and Cheney were only too happy to use that horrific attack, which we just commemorated this week, as an excuse for going to war. And the kind of rhetoric coming out of Trump's mouth, talking about how he wants to punish the radical left, and much, much worse stuff being said by his allies, both in Congress and Charlie Kirk types, you know, the influencer types in the MAGA cinematic universe, is really feels a lot worse, I think, than anything that we've seen so far this year.
Yeah, and I thought Trump's initial video on this kind of gave up the game that they're playing. There are a lot of reasons that video was interesting. I mean, it was clearly heavily edited, if not kind of like AI enhanced. I'm sure you saw some of the frame by frames where like his pinky disappears in some
I
of the
actually didn't see
frames, and
this.
yeah, because of course Trump did it, and this is maybe a little bit of a side tangent, but Trump did a public appearance yesterday for a 9/11 commemoration at the Pentagon, and you maybe did, maybe didn't, the images of his mouth drooping,
Those I
which
saw.
were, yes, which of course kind of comes on the heels of all the speculation about his health. He basically vanished from the public eye for about a week over Labor Day, and people wondering if he had COVID, or then there was kind of speculation, people putting together, some connecting some of the dots and speculating that possibly he'd had a stroke or some mini strokes or something like that. So this video that Trump released on his social media channels to basically politicize the Charlie Kirk passing, I was going to say pay tribute to him, but that really wasn't what it was. It was more kind of like declaring war on the left. And then, because the video kind of looked AI enhanced, and there was some kind of jump cuts that were weird. And like I said, there are frames where it looked like one of his fingers was kind of disappearing. I wouldn't go as far as to say that this was an AI video, but it certainly, there were some funky things going on there. But in this video, he brought up some of the examples of political violence, but of course he didn't include the assassination of Melissa Hortman here in Minnesota, the shooting of another legislator here. He didn't bring up the attempted assassination of Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, it's just so heavy-handed in terms of how they try to kind of scapegoat the left for this, have no accountability on their own side. And, I guess Trump has kind of alluded to, we need to, today on Fox and Friends, he was talking about, we need to investigate Soros. We need to investigate the people who are funding these demonstrations or funding the incitement against the right. To me, a lot of that just kind of rings like the typical Trumpian rhetoric, where I don't really anticipate there being much follow through to that. There was another clip from yesterday where Trump was asked how he is coping with the loss of his dear personal friend, Charlie Kirk. And by all accounts, they did seem relatively close. But Trump immediately pivoted to talking about the new ballroom in the White House. I mean, he barely had like a word of condolence. And certainly didn't seem to be personally affected in a deep way by it. So, a lot of the stuff, we're kind of in the midst of a very bewildering news cycle, and facts are kind of trickling out as we speak. I don't anticipate this, especially as a little more distance comes between what happened 2 days ago and today, to really lead to a sea change in terms of the way Trump handles Democrats. Or I don't anticipate this to be kind of the beginning of like this huge wave of suppression against Democrats. But again, the narrative is so transparently clear that Trump is only concerned about political violence insofar as he can weaponize it against his political foes, that I just hope that this is clear to people at this point, that no one really gives him the presumption of good faith or the benefit of the doubt that this is something he sincerely means to address. And I have seen that from some people on social media today, basically saying, what this country really needs is a uniter, and Trump is failing us yet again. And it's just like, of course he is. I mean, we've known this guy for a decade now. Whenever there is any sort of disaster or outburst of violence, he tries to find a way to capitalize on it politically to score points. And that's kind of the name of the game for his whole movement at this point. I mean, I think there are some people out there who are sincerely affected by the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I mean, I will say that myself on a human level, having kids who are around his age, and, by all accounts, I mean, his wife seemed to adore him. And, even though some people who I wouldn't necessarily think of as being like bad people who found value in some of his commentary and thought that, he had good things to say, or maybe they admired the fact that he was willing to go to college campuses and engage with people who have different political views, even though I find the views that he supported to be loathsome by and large. So, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but, in terms of the people who are out there really trying to politicize this, it's for the end of basically kind of demonizing their opponents and using this as an excuse to further try to suppress left-wing voices. And, I guess maybe this is a little more broad of a point, but, I do think this is a really bad moment for free speech and political speech in our country. And I'm just trying to imagine, if I was the type of influencer who was out there doing public events like Charlie Kirk was, and like someone like Hassan Piker on the left does, I'd be really scared right now, because there is a faction of people on the right who they've said this openly, that they view this as kind of a declaration of war. They think this is armed conflict, and like, who's going to be next? I mean, presumably someone is going to be the target of an attempted retaliation. And it's just kind of, a scary time to be out there talking about politics from anywhere other than the safety of your own home. And even then, we saw in Minnesota that even in your home, you're not necessarily safe.
Yeah, and that's just it, that even if Trump doesn't really have the kind of follow through that, frankly, he almost always lacks on this, the rhetoric, both from him and all of his allies, is going to inflame people. There's no question about that. And, we're probably going to see more worse and heinous crimes as a result of this. But to your point about the follow through, Aaron, it really is remarkable that I feel like I don't want to diagnose Trump from afar, but his inability to just stay focused, to stay on one topic, I feel like undermines Republicans all of the time. And that he will either too quickly move on from something where Republicans might, in theory, have a political advantage they can press, or he will just simply say the exact wrong and opposite thing of what his allies wish that he would say. And we saw it. I mean, God, what going on, was it Fox and Friends, and saying this is going to be great for your ratings. And
Yeah.
then Eric Trump, as you shared with me, immediately trying to use Charlie Kirk's death to hawk his new book.
Yeah.
I think that if history is any guide, they're going to quickly start saying things that erase a lot of sympathy and also just screw up themselves somehow and wind up moving on to the next thing. I mean, like, it's not like Epstein is going away.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it did kind of go away this week for kind of obvious reasons that, they're just bigger things going on with, obviously the shooting of Charlie Kirk. But yeah, I mean, the example that you cite, for people who hadn't seen it, Trump went on Fox and Friends this morning, which was like a very hyped interview given kind of the broader circumstances. And the first thing he said was he basically announced the arrest of this Tyler Robinson in Utah. But the way that he did it was so awkward, where he kind of started with like, I have to be careful because I don't want Fox News to get sued. Of course, then your mind goes to like, well, they had a $787 million settlement from a lawsuit a couple years ago, but Trump was oblivious to that. But, he kind of framed it in this like, I don't want to get sued and this is unconfirmed information, but we think we have the guy. And then he went from there to talking about how, because Ainsley Earhart, one of the hosts, is, I believe, engaged to Sean Hannity. And so that turned, and Trump, every time he goes on Fox and Friends, he comments on their relationship in really kind of uncomfortable ways. But he said something to the effect of like, I'm sure Sean's going to be upset that this isn't happening on his show, but, this is a big scoop for you guys. Kind of right away framing this around TV ratings, kind of like attracting eyeballs, where, this is supposedly one of his like closest confidants, someone that he supposedly, if you believe what was in the New York Times, kind of viewed as almost like a son-like figure for himself. And, he couldn't even really pretend for even a few minutes to be kind of deeply affected by it. It was all about like, I'm giving you guys the scoop, and isn't this really breaking news here on Fox that we've arrested this guy? So, and then the Eric Trump thing, I think again, this was very telling. And I've heard him use this talking point before, but he went on Benny Johnson's show. Benny Johnson, of course, was most recently in national news because it turned out that he was being bankrolled either, unwittingly or wittingly by the Kremlin. He had funding coming in from Russia for his show. But Eric Trump was on there basically saying the bullets are only going one way and the decorum only goes one way. And the implication being that this political violence is a left-wing problem, not a societal problem, and not something that his father or their political movement is doing more than anyone else to kind of foment in the country. So yeah, I mean, it's just, it's kind of hard to swallow. Again, I guess I would put this under the heading of shocking but not surprising because we've lived through many news cycles like this. And I'm just, in some ways, had this shooter been someone who was transgender, I mean, you could just imagine how ugly this could have gotten, because it seems like the shooter didn't really fall into one of those boxes of demonization that MAGA likes to, kind of attack or blame or scapegoat. Maybe in that sense, this is, not the worst case scenario in terms of what this means culturally, and the fallout from it. But yeah, that was kind of, obviously I was processing just the horror of the Kirk assassination. I mean, the fact that, and I was trying to think about this, that I can't think of another instance with maybe like the exception of Gaddafi being killed all those years ago, where something like this was caught on tape and kind of like spread all over the internet. And, that's really kind of traumatizing in its own right, seeing these images of someone being killed. And it kind of straddles this line between like, is it news? Is it kind of like, a snuff film or both? But, so just kind of processing that. And then also in the back of my mind thinking like, man, if this is one of those populations that MAGA likes to scapegoat who did this, like you can kind of see how we're, the gasoline has been poured all over our society, and all it takes is kind of the flick of a lit match to really set things on fire. Not that this won't, but again, you can just see with the groundwork that's been laid by MAGA, how we're really close to kind of a full-on tinderbox. Hopefully we end up avoiding that. But we're still kind of really early in this news cycle, I think.
So Dan Epstein asks a really good question about another aspect of this, which is how long can Kash Patel hang on at the FBI with his amateurish responses, firing all the experienced investigators? And how does this fit in with Trump's broader pattern of throwing people under the bus or not? And I feel like Kash Patel maybe just got very lucky today, in that, this suspect was apprehended, assuming that they have the right guy, of course. But I mean, it really was Keystone Cops in a remarkable way. And the reporting about the FBI has been nothing short of scary. That experienced agents are leaving the agency or being sidelined. And at the same time, law enforcement from all across the federal government is being sent over to ICE to help arrest people who haven't committed any crimes, while not actually pursuing the serious criminals or trying to prevent serious crimes from happening. I feel I don't know, maybe if there's further reporting about the failure to stop this guy, or the ham-fisted investigation, maybe someone like Patel takes the fall. But right now, I would feel like he survives. But Aaron, I feel like that's the sort of Trump Kremlinology that you're far better at than I.
Yeah, no, I think that you're exactly right with your characterization of Cash kind of getting lucky here, because, if you go back just 12 hours from when Trump announced that they had a suspect in custody, there was a press conference last night in Utah, which apparently Cash Patel and Bongino flew in. They were on the East Coast yesterday for some of the 9/11 commemorations, but they flew to Utah to kind of oversee the investigation, whatever that would mean. In the case of two guys who don't really have a lot of law enforcement experience that would be relevant for an investigation of this sort. And then they had this press conference last night where, kind of the takeaway was that they didn't really have any good leads. And, they're kind of pleading with people if they had information to come forward, which, I'm not a cop. And I don't have a background in police investigations. So, but given the fact that they had images of this person, and, it wasn't like they were kind of like blurry, faraway images. They had shots of his face and his clothes. And then they had video of him, running and jumping off the roof of the building from which he shot Charlie Kirk. I mean, that kind of surprised me that they didn't have more to work with at that point. And then even today, I mean, the story of how Tyler Robinson was arrested was basically that, I believe it was his father, had suspicions and kind of confronted him and apparently persuaded him to turn himself in. And yet at this press conference today, which came after the arrest had happened, I mean, Cash was taking this victory lap, kind of saying like, we made amazing progress for Charlie in just 33 hours. And this is what happens when you let good cops be cops. And it's like, the family turned this guy in. I mean, so I guess to the extent that releasing the images, maybe alerted the family members that this guy allegedly did this, I suppose that was their contribution to this investigation. But certainly doesn't seem like an example of like amazing police work. And this is one of the examples because I think there's been, you put all of these clowns in charge of these federal agencies. And sometimes I think it can be kind of hard to track how putting them in charge leads to negative real world impacts. I mean, I guess we're kind of seeing that with RFK, where, if you make COVID vaccines unavailable to people, like that's a very tangible negative impact of putting an anti vaxxer in charge of public health. But in this case, I do get the sense, and, I think you're right to kind of sound a note of caution that we're going to need to see more reporting on this. Cash had just overseen a purge of that Salt Lake FBI field office. There's some indications that maybe that played a role in disorganization there. I'm sure we'll read more on that in the days and weeks to come. But it did strike me that this kind of clunky, disorganized investigation that, in probably the highest profile shooting in terms of someone being assassinated in a long time in our country, that even though they had images of this guy, even though there were obviously thousands of witnesses, I think it was something like 4,000 people were at the event when Charlie Kirk was speaking when he was shot. If they didn't have more to go on, I think does kind of allude to some of the dysfunction and the fact that guys like Kash Patel and Bongino are in way over their head in running this law enforcement agency.
I think though the comparison with RFK, I think, is really instructive in a lot of ways, because I think most your average American is never really going to feel a huge difference between a functional FBI and a less than functional one. But with the RFK kind of just wrecking shop at the CDC and actually affecting people's access to healthcare, it seems to me, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that that's more likely to draw a public response in terms of increased unfavorability for the Trump administration than the Keystone Cops shit at the FBI.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, when you mentioned kind of the unfavorability, I think that's going to be kind of interesting to track because, I mean, we've all seen it in the media the last few days in terms of like this valorization of Charlie Kirk. I couldn't actually bring myself to read the piece, but the Ezra Klein piece, which has gotten a lot of criticism about like how Charlie Kirk was doing politics the right way. Maybe that was one of those instances where the headline was a lot worse than the actual piece itself. But that's one of those things for me that's kind of, it's kind of an annoyance of mine where you'll get this reaction where there's an article that has terrible framing and you criticize the framing, and then people, they encourage you to read the article. It's like, read the article before you criticize. It's like, if the framing is that bad, I am not obligated to read this. Like, sometimes It's just, yeah. And so but the point simply being that, there has been kind of this rallying around Charlie Kirk dynamic where he's been portrayed as like this kind of brave truth teller who went and debated people and, really kind of, in that sense, was kind of practicing this noble brand of politics. And, it's a different case. But when we think back on Trump's attempted assassination, back in the summer of last year, like that did actually really help him politically. I mean, that kind of got him off the map or off the mat. And then if you remember just a couple of weeks after that at the RNC, there was this sense of like invincibility around his campaign. It was inevitable he was going to be reelected. Of course, that was before Biden had stepped out of the race. But, I do wonder if kind of this outpouring that we've seen of emotion, this support for Charlie Kirk that we've seen coming from some unexpected places, if that will actually kind of help Trump since he's so closely associated to Charlie Kirk. I don't know if that's going to be the case. But I do wonder if, maybe the fact that Kash Patel led this dysfunctional investigation, if some of that stuff kind of gets forgotten. Because I think a lot of people, they're going to tune into the news today. They're going to see that an arrest was made. They're not necessarily going to reflect on the fact that it took longer than usual for them to find this suspect, given the information that was out there. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a little early to kind of game out what this is going to mean for public opinion. But, I will say, and I think this has kind of been a little bit overlooked, that in the context of how people have been talking about this story, Charlie Kirk was a really big deal in MAGA. I mean, his show, he was the most prominent Republican senators, House members, Trump world influencers on there regularly. His Turning Points events regularly featured Trump as the keynote speaker, going back to when Trump was kind of in the wilderness, in 2021 into early 22. Trump was speaking at the Turning Point events. So it does leave a huge void because, similar to Trump, he had a certain type of charisma, especially with younger men. And, younger men ended up being a demographic last year that was very crucial to Trump's ultimate victory in the election. And so, there's already kind of been some talk. I heard Trump talking about this day about like who's going to replace Charlie Kirk. I heard Ben Shapiro kind of tossed his hat in the ring as like, well, I'll go to campuses and kind of do the debate me thing that Charlie Kirk was doing. But I don't think it's quite so easy. And so, I do kind of think that it's going to leave a void in the MAGA movement in terms of someone who really was good with engaging with young men and getting them to go vote for Republican candidates. But, the countervailing thing to that is I do think there is kind of the sense whenever someone is the victim of violence of this sort, there's kind of an outpouring of emotion. Even if people didn't really know what Charlie Kirk was all about, if they just read kind of the obits that are in the mainstream media this week, you would think he was kind of this, heroic figure. And, maybe that does give a little bit of boost, if not to Trump specifically, then to kind of the broader movement itself.
I think it's really interesting that as influential as Charlie Kirk might have been in the MAGA movement, on a fundamental level, he was nobody in the sense that you have foreign heads of state putting out statements about this guy's death. And maybe I'm wrong. I would be kind of surprised if Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, actually put out a statement when Melissa Hortman was assassinated in Minnesota, the former House Speaker there. So I think I just feel like the attention he is getting is very much disproportionate to how just famous and important he was. And again, your average American, I guarantee you 95% of Americans had never heard of Charlie Kirk before this week. And so, yeah, they can politicize this and weaponize this, and they are, and they will. And there will probably be bad things that happen as a result of this. But I just don't see it as having a long-term political impact in the way that Republicans might fantasize. And also, you mentioned the Trump assassination attempt last year. That was also kind of weird because I was so sure that they would talk about nothing but that for the remaining 3 or 4 months, whatever it was before the election. And that's the exact opposite of what happened. They were like oddly eager to kind of move on after that, despite the obvious bump that it gave them in sympathy and attention. And so like if Trump's attempted assassination did not wind up having real staying power, then Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's a little bit of a side point. I think the political impact, because we're not close to any sort of elections or anything like that, so it's a little bit hard to gauge. Of course, you had New York Yankees this week before Trump attended their game yesterday. He did a moment of silence with like an image, which is certainly not something that they did for Melissa Hortman. But I do think also, kind of setting the partisan politics aside. I mean, I do think a part of the reason that this has been so captivating is the very grim fact that it was caught on tape in the way that it was. I'll speak for myself. I was running around. We had just moved, and so I was kind of doing house-related chores, and and I started getting texts and saw some things coming across the transom on social media that Charlie Kirk had been shot, and like of course, like I knew it was very serious, but then when you saw the video, it was clear that he probably wasn't going to survive, and just how graphic it was, and then of course the videos got tens of millions of views across like multiple platforms. So, and that, maybe that's kind of like another thing that's sort of fascinating about this is even later into the day, on I believe it was Wednesday when this happened, I was pulling up social media and pushed into my algorithmic feeds with like new angles of the shooting, so you just see this guy getting murdered over and over, and like what that does to people. I'm sure it doesn't do them anything good, but I do think that was part of it, was just like how in front of everybody this was. You couldn't really avoid it. And then, of course, on the other side of that, you had people, posting videos of him and his kids and them kind of, hugging and like just, him as like this family man. So I think it was kind of emotionally more resonant in that way that maybe other instances of political violence that don't get captured on film are. That's just kind of my sense of things. But, I do think that when you brought up the point of like heads of state weighing in on this, I mean, that is a little bit weird when you consider that someone like Melissa Hortman, at least, in this part of the world in Minnesota, was an extremely influential figure, didn't really get that sort of treatment, at least to the same level. I don't totally know what explains that. I mean, maybe part of it is just that, we live in this world now where if you're Keir Starmer, you understand that, to do business with the United States, you have to really kind of kiss up to Trump and sort of glorify him whenever you can. And, Charlie Kirk obviously was very close to Trump. And so maybe it's just kind of an extension of that sycophancy that we've seen where, in order to stay in Trump's good graces, you have to kind of go the extra mile and, really, put out there how sad you are or how affected you are by Charlie Kirk's passing.
Yeah, and they're acting as though they are sadder than Trump, who, as you pointed out, can't even be bothered. I wanted to return to something you mentioned earlier about Trump's drooping face and the strange, possibly AI inflected video that he released. And not gonna try to be, Senator Bill Frist diagnosing Donald Trump on tape. I'm not. I don't even play a doctor at home. But the weird videos reminded me of something else that's happened in the last day and a half, which is when law enforcement started releasing these somewhat blurrier images of the suspected shooter. All these goofball amateur sleuths online started trying to use AI to enhance the
Yeah.
image. Like, I mean, as though it's, some network TV show, NCIS or something like that. And the various products that they came up with didn't look anything like the guy.
Yeah.
And this is just another good opportunity to remind people that when there is breaking news like this, especially about a shooting, a lot of the early information is going to be wrong, and that you really do have to
Yeah.
slow down and try to trust reliable media sources. And if someone is sharing some report, and their blue sky account has a million emojis in the name, and they don't have any background as a journalist, let's pause and be a little bit more skeptical of that kind of stuff. Now, that's not to say that the major mainstream outlets won't get stuff wrong too, because they often do as well. And we've seen that happen
Yeah.
plenty often with shootings in the past. But damn, when you have law enforcement this bumbling, at least the DC law
Oh, yeah.
enforcement this bumbling, you just got to be extra, extra cautious these days.
Yeah. And, to kind of bring it back to the Cash Patel conversation, I mean, we didn't even get into that where, of course, his initial response was, we have someone in custody. This was like an hour after the shooting occurred. So everybody's
Right.
thinking, great, like they got the guy. And then, kind of sort of trickling out that, maybe not. They're questioning someone, but it's not clear if this is really who did it. And then, we had to quote tweet himself basically saying, like, after interrogation, this is not the person who did it. Like, the
Yeah.
investigation continues. And it's like, this is what happens when you have an FBI director who's number one objective to social media clout.
Yeah.
Like, you don't live tweet these things, because you want to wait until you actually have good, solid information before you go public. Because, imagine if you were trying to, do kind of your own investigation. Like, imagine if you were the family members of this kid who they now arrested. Maybe you suspect something was wrong. Maybe that looks like Tyler in the image that we saw, but then you see Cash tweeting that, oh, we have someone. It's like, oh, then it couldn't have been him. Then there's a lot of
Right.
impacts to getting bad information out there like that. So yeah, I mean, that's another thing that kind of gets me thinking, had this extended further into the weekend and the next week, I do think the pressure would have increased on Cash, either get his act together or get someone in there who could be competent in that role. But I'm just reflecting on some of the things that I saw in the hours and days following the shooting where, you had kind of these amateur investigators on Twitter, especially, who were like outing people based on kind of nothing, based on social media posts. You almost wonder if these people, I don't think it would cross the line necessarily into defamation because there wouldn't necessarily be like malice involved in this, but, you're just kind of wrecking people's lives over nothing, and so, hopefully people are kind of scrubbing those threads if they did that. I saw a lot of that, especially on X. I can't speak on what was going on Blue Sky because I wasn't quite as immersed in like the conversation surrounding it. This was one of those events where being on X was a little bit more useful because I really wanted to see what the right wingers were saying. And you get less of that on Blue Sky. But yeah, I mean, that's part of the thing that we're encountering in the social media age is, it's really easy to kind of point the finger at the wrong people because, you're working with partial information. People think that they're smarter than the professional investigators. But, in this case, I guess, back to the Cash point, the professional investigators weren't doing a very good job either. So, yeah.
To your point, Aaron, going after random people in that manner could definitely be defamatory because accusing someone of a crime is generally considered defamation per se. And if they're just an ordinary civilian and not a public figure, that heightened standard of proving malice on the part of the person making the claim doesn't apply. It's still very hard to go after people like that. And also, let's say you're targeted by some rando on Twitter, what's the point of even suing them? It's not like you're going to get money. Maybe you could get them to delete the tweet at best. This is a sort of a weakness. Maybe that's not really the right word, but it's something in the fabric of our democracy that the right has been so able and willing to exploit in terms of their ability and willingness to tell lies or just have a total disregard for the truth. And really harm people as a result. And there's so rarely been penalties for that. But you did allude to one of them, of course, which is Fox News getting sued so massively by the voting machine makers. But then the problem there is Fox is still up to its old shit. They can
Yeah.
afford $787 million.
Right. And, I think that's another point that's worth making in this conversation is, over on NBC, you had Matthew Dowd, who, I can't remember his right in front of me, but he, when they were talking kind of in real time on Wednesday about the Kirk assassination, he said something, he basically highlighted the fact that Kirk, you know, promoted a lot of, spread a lot of incendiary rhetoric himself and was kind of taking that tact, instead of valorizing him, kind of pointing out that, Kirk stood for a lot of bad things. And, he ended up being let go of his contributor role there. Whereas on Fox, you had Jesse Waters basically like turning the incitement up to 11, saying like, this is war. We're not going to take this, and to me, it was just another very clear example of how there's really only standards on one side of these issues now, where, if you're on the left, you have to really police yourself to make sure that you're not overstepping a line where you might lose your job. Or, we saw yesterday, I sent you this before we went live, where, Ilhan Omar was on with Mehdi Hassan, and she said something to the effect, it was basically highlighting some of the racist things that Kirk had said, and wokeness on X, which is an account that has millions of followers, took part of what she said out of context and kind of mischaracterized it. The clip had like 7 million views, and it rose to a level where Ilhan felt compelled to kind of respond and clarify what she said, pointing out that she was being what she said was being taken out of context and kind of misconstrued. But we have to be so fearful on the left that we're going to become, a target of these harassment campaigns, whereas on the right, you can just kind of go hog wild and say, basically declare war on half the country. And that's just like kind of normal politics. So, I do think it's important, and I always kind of feel this way whenever there's an incident like this, that you don't want to lower yourself to the level of the people that you are trying to kind of defeat in the realm of ideas and, in the political sphere. You don't want to be as bad as they are. Not to use the old cliche of like, when they go low, we go high, but sometimes it's best just to, take a breath before you use someone's assassination as like a news peg to trash on them. But I just, ideally we live in a world or in a country where the standards kind of applied equally. And I think we see, this is one of the clearest examples, the fallout from the Kirk assassination. Now, like, we're really playing by a much stricter set of rules on the left, whereas on the right, it's just fair game. You have a president who's just blatantly lying and mischaracterizing what's going on. It's like just Trump being Trump.
There was absolutely nothing that Matthew Dowd said that was wrong. But the most amazing thing is that he was a Bush guy. He was a top operative for George W. Bush. And so someone like that is getting turfed out for telling the truth in, frankly, a very mild way. Then we're all at risk for sure. But also, what's going on in this country today doesn't happen without decades and decades of groundwork being laid. Someone like Matthew Dowd, he helped create a framework for the world that begat Trump. Because we were talking about it earlier on the show, Bush was always too happy to use pretexts to advance his political aims in violent ways, and also, gave rise to a much more callous and incendiary type of Republican. And then obviously exploded with the Tea Party wave shortly after Bush left office. And you can draw a straight line from there to here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, boy, I'm almost kind of wistful these days for the for the Bush years in certain ways. I mean, not to minimize how terrible it was, but and there was a little bit more stability, at least in our domestic conversations with each other. At least that's how I remember it. I was pretty young and impressionable at that age still, but yeah, I mean, now it's just man. And for me personally, of course, we haven't had a show since the Annunciation shooting happened here in Minneapolis, which affected my family, and so like, I don't know. It's just whether I kind of reflect on my life personally or kind of reflect on the broader society. I mean, there's this sense that things are kind of coming unglued or spiraling out of control. That's really kind of disorienting, really. And I felt kind of compelled right after the Kirk thing, as that was breaking, to just kind of lay low because I certainly didn't want to make myself any part of the story or like further. I really wanted not to inflame things in this instance. because yeah, it's getting to be like an increasingly terrifying world, and it's too early to kind of know how this is going to play out. But I really am concerned for like the freedom of political speech going forward, because I think we are going to see this being used as a pretext to really kind of crack down. Where and we see this where it's like calling Trump a fascist is incitement, even though it's like an accurate description of what he's doing. And so, you get into this bind where when you try to make kind of accurate descriptions that aren't sanitized, instead of calling Trump like a strong leader, you call him a fascist because he's breaking the law, he's destroying our democracy, but then you're inciting violence against him, and so then you become a target. So, I think that's kind of part of the intention in the way that Trump and his minions kind of talk about violence like this. They want to chill people's speech. So that's kind of what I'm really concerned about, as this plays out. So it's going to take a lot of bravery, for people to continue to talk about Trump, frankly, what he's doing to the country, and to speak out. And again, I really feel for people who really, are putting themselves on the line more directly, in the sense that they're going out there in public. We saw with Charlie Kirk, he had a private security team. Like he took all the precautions that you could possibly take, short of having like a secret security detail. And even that, you get one crazy person who is skilled with the gun, and that's all it takes. And in that way, I reflect on, and you're a little bit older than me, but I reflect on kind of coming of age in the 1990s into the early 2000s, and there was a sense as I was kind of learning American history of like, 1968, that was a really crazy time, and like Kent State, man, I can't believe that that protesters were killed, but there was kind of a sense of like, wow, we've really kind of moved past that, and it seems like we're in this kind of new era of politics where, yeah, people fight, and there are big issues on the line, but we're not out there killing people. We don't have the troops on the street shooting people. And now here we are. We're kind of right back to sort of that feeling that things are kind of spiraling out of control. And usually, politically, that doesn't play out great, because then people kind of feel that need to pull a lever for kind of law and order. We're seeing that was a very fake thing with Trump, the idea that he was law and order, as things kind of spiral out of control, and the FBI is dysfunctional. But that's kind of what I'm concerned about, is that in my lifetime there's really been nothing kind of like this moment that we're living through, and it feels really unpredictable, kind of in a bad way, in terms of like where things go from here.
Well, I do want to end on positive note, would not be the right term, but I want to try to move in a slightly more uplifting direction, which is, Aaron, you talked about the threats to free speech and to the media and intimidation of people in our line of work. But I think this underscores why the kind of independent journalism that folks like us and many, many of our colleagues do is so important, because the large media companies, we have seen how so many of them are just kowtowing to Trump because they don't want to risk his anger, because they want to get mergers passed through, because they just want to avoid scrutiny. And so they're doing things like, boom, firing Matthew Dowd for telling the truth. But the beauty of independent media and small sites like ours is there are so many of them. And even the most determined autocrat could not shut down every last truth-telling newsletter on Substack or Ghost or Beehive or WordPress or any of another of a million small platforms. And I think having a robust independent media like ours, like the one that we are part of, is so important right now, precisely because its distributed nature protects against attack from the top. And thank God, because Aaron, people like you're sharing unfiltered clips and truth about what people are saying and doing right now. And you're not afraid to do that. And, we're getting real insight into what the right is actually saying about this, not the sanitized versions that major media outlets are putting out there. And there are hundreds and thousands of sites like ours. And thankfully, I'm very, very grateful that we have this massive network and growing network of folks who are outside of that mainstream major media world who are still willing to tell the truth.
Yeah, thank you. And, David, obviously your site does absolutely amazing coverage of down ballot races. I know this week for you has probably been kind of a different one, because I feel like all the down ballot stuff, which, there are a lot of down ballot stories that we could talk about, but like every other story kind of got pushed out of the news this week. And you mentioned, when you mentioned Epstein earlier, I was kind of like, oh yeah, I had forgotten about him. So yeah, but anyway, I mean, hopefully, when we reconvene next week, hopefully there will be less of depressing. I mean, it is depressing, but kind of less scary things to talk about. Maybe kind of more normal politics things to talk about. And then, as a sidebar, you wanted to bring up some positive news at the end. I was emoting to you before we went live that, obviously I just moved and we have like rocket speed internet, which crashed right before we went live. Immediately before I hopped on with you, I was on the phone with the support for my internet. And as we've been on this call, I see that my internet's back. So next week
Woohoo!
on the show, I will be debuting my rocket speed internet. I don't know, probably today it was fine anyway, but I'll look even. You'll see even more of the blemishes on my face and the thinning hair. So look forward to that next week. And in the meantime, I highly recommend those of you who are tuned in who might be public notice subscribers, if you're not already subscribing to David at the Down Ballot, especially as we grow or as we draw nearer and nearer to the midterm cycle. It's going to be an absolutely indispensable resource to keep you up to speed on all of the key races. Not only as Democrats, I think, try to retake the House, but, I think maybe it's something we could talk about next week or in future weeks, I think have a real shot real shot. It's still not like a over 50% shot, but a real shot of retaking the Senate as well. So
I'd be
there's lots
happy
to talk about
that.
even if this week it got completely shunted from the news because all we're talking about is kind of the terrible stuff that happened in Utah.
I am going to end though on one note. You gave me an insight with when you brought Epstein back up, which is there is a down ballot connection here because there was a special election in Virginia earlier this week for the seat held by the late Congressman Jerry Connolly, and Democrat James Waukesha won it in a massive blowout. He won it by 50 points. He overperformed the district by 16 points. Another strong showing for Democrats, but he was also almost immediately sworn into the House. And as soon as he was sworn in, he signed the discharge petition being put forth by Thomas Massie, the Republican from Kentucky, to demand the release of the Epstein files. And there's another special election later this month, also in a very blue seat in Arizona. Raul Grijalva's seat, his daughter Adelita is running there. So she is going to be welcomed into Congress very soon as well. So we're getting super, super close to the 218 signatures on that petition. We will talk more about that next week, I'm sure.
Well, that's a cliffhanger. All right. Yeah, I look forward to that. And thank you. We had a great audience this week. Over 1,600 people tuned in. And obviously, there's a lot of interest in the Charlie Kirk story. So we appreciate all you guys joining us. And just a reminder that in future weeks, if you want to ask us questions as we chat, please sign up for a paid subscription, either to Public Notice or the Down Ballot, or ideally both.
Both.
Because, David, you mentioned earlier the importance of independent media, sites like yours and mine. And it doesn't happen without people paying for it. So, certainly if you're frustrated with some of the coverage that you see in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, we didn't even really get into this, but, they had the piece yesterday kind of,
oh God,
insinuating that it was, okay. We'll table that. The Wall Street Journal had a very shameful piece yesterday that they eventually retracted, but not before it kind of got injected in the bloodstream where, I saw Donald Trump Jr. still talking about it today. So, if that kind of coverage frustrates you and you want to support more responsible forms of political journalism, please consider signing up for the Down Ballot and for Public Notice. We'll leave it there for this week, but we will see you 7 days from today.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
See ya.